Henry to talk about the 2020 State Water Plan. Erik Dahl is a planning director at the Environmental Quality Board, and his recent work includes the development of the State Water Plan, environmental review rulemaking, the Energy and Environment Report Card, and silica sand policy for the state. Suzanne Reese is a special projects coordinator at Minnesota Bowser, Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, where she does work on issues involving climate, water quality, and agriculture. A member of the team that developed the state water plan, Suzanne is now engaged on a number of initiatives for the climate sub-cabinet in the areas of natural and working lands and resilience and adaptation. Welcome, the two of you. One of the things that I noticed in the water plan that really surprised me, I guess, really brought home the importance of this water plan is that the flow in the Minnesota River, you say in there, has increased by 75% in the past 20 years as opposed to the past previous 6 decades, I think you said. That was amazing to me.
Yeah, that is pretty striking.
Yeah, pretty substantial. Yeah. We were pretty surprised by that too. And I was just talking to some high school students about that yesterday and about what we're seeing with projections for precipitation in Minnesota for, depending on our emission scenarios. And, maybe we'll see that even increase even more over the next century here, unless we can get some of this work done, which all of you are probably part of making sure the work is getting done and reaching these goals and strategies. So hopefully we can turn that back.
Well, great. And with that, why don't you take it away and tell us about your work on the 2020 State Water Plan.
All right, thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks for having us. I'm Erik Cedarleaf Dahl, and I was the lead on this project, but really the team that helped develop it really was crucial to making sure that we got everything in this plan and we focused on the right things. And Suzanne Reese was a really important part of development of this, and she's working for the Board of Water and Soil Resources. And this 2020 State Water Plan is focused on water and climate. Thanks for giving us time on your agenda today. I'm going to just give you a little background on EQB and the water plan, the water plan's purpose. Then we'll go through the goals, strategies, and actions at a relatively high level, and you all can ask questions if you have any during that time, or we can wait till the end too. But okay, so who's the Environmental Quality Board? Maybe you all know, but just to bring you back to focus on what it is, the board was created in 1973 when Minnesota passed the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA. EQB is made up of the heads of 9 state agencies. You see them there on the slide. As well as 8 public members from each of Minnesota's congressional districts. Our main work areas of focus is, of course, the environmental review program, but then we also do a lot of interagency projects and planning where something maybe doesn't land specifically in an agency's wheelhouse, like emerald ash borer crosses multiple agencies, or solar on closed landfill. We were directed by the legislature to do that. And then we also do a lot of public engagement. We have monthly meetings the third Wednesday of every month, and the public is welcome to join us there. And that's kind of our main focus at a high level. So why are we doing a state water plan? The legislature directs us to do that in 103B.151. It gave EQB authority to coordinate state water resource planning. And this is just one of several statutes that direct us to do the state water plan. And we've completed a state water plan every 10 years since 1991. We did one in 2000, 2010, and then in 2020. So what's the water plan purpose? This water plan, after we had a board retreat, which the board directed EQB staff to try and focus on, spend most of our time focusing on water resource planning and climate change. And That then led to, after more discussions with our board members about that with this water plan, we should really shine a spotlight on climate change and how it'll impact water resources and water planning efforts in the state. The audience for this water plan is the legislature, but also always a broad public audience, which can be difficult for EQB. To give the enough detail for legislators to hopefully take action, but then the broad public, because we always have lots of public coming to our meetings and they read our documents, and so we want to give them a good sense of what the state is doing in this area. And then our other purpose is to align with other state water planning efforts. The PCA, DNR, Ag, Health are all doing lots of work in water planning, and we don't want to usurp those. We just want to help align and shine a light on some of those other planning efforts, because that's where a lot of the real work is being done. This is more of a broad policy document. So then also, as you'll see in my next couple slides, we want to highlight the recent science to give backup to why we're suggesting some of these recommendations. And then in this water plan, we really wanted to also focus on social aspects of climate and water, how climate change and will impact water resources and the equity concerns. We have a whole section on tribal nations and what tribal nations are working on, and then focus on this idea of quality of life and how climate change impacts our quality of life. Okay, so a little bit on the science, and I'm sure a lot of you know a lot about this, but Minnesota's shifted to a much wetter and warmer climate in the past several decades. Compared to the 20th century averages, all but 2 years since 1970 have been some combination of wet and or warm, and each of the 10 combined wettest and warmest years on record all occurred from 1998 onward. You can see this is a chart we got from the DNR from Kenny Blumenfeld in the climatology office, and each of those blue dots and red dots represent the yearly average of precipitation and temperature. And you can see the red dots are from 1998 onward, and they've all been wetter and warmer. And so although our climate will vary from year to year with occasional cool and dry years, climate scientists expect these increases to continue through the 21st century. And that's what those yellow dots are. So we worked with the U of M, basically utilized their science with Bonnie Keeler, Ryan Noe, and the Institute on Environment. And those are some projections for what we might see by the mid-century and end of century based on different emission scenarios. And so we can see we're trending toward much warmer and wetter years on average. And so here's some more of the maps from the U of M. This is looking at climate change projections for increases in precipitation. All these maps show percent change from 1980 to 99 averages into 3 future scenarios. As you can see, we've got the moderate emissions scenario in mid-century, a moderate emissions scenario by the end of century, and then this high emissions scenario. And the high emissions scenario is really the path we're currently on, and so this is what it looks like for annual amount of rain compared to 1990. The wettest day in a typical year in that high emission scenario is projected to be about 20% wetter than during the 1990s, with potentially larger spikes in a given year. And then we also looked at that although we haven't seen an increase in drought severity during the last couple decades, and although a dry spell is not equivalent to drought, climate projections suggest that the length of the longest dry spell in the growing season may increase. And Minnesota should expect at least an occasional episode of severe drought with even with the wetter climate. And so what the impacts we're already seeing is shorter winters. We're seeing shorter ice fishing season and more very hot days, and that's changing some of our quality of life, which warmer lakes change those fish species composition. And so that's just a little bit of the science. There's a whole section on the basis of why we're talking about climate change and water in the water plan at eqb.state.mn.us if you want to read it, or we can put it in the chat when we're finished. And so, okay, the team then worked on what should the goals be for the water plan, and then the goals lead to strategies, which then have actions associated with them. So the water plan's organized around 5 goals that the state should focus on over the next 10 years and beyond to be resilient in the face of climate change. These goals were formulated through extensive discussion with agency water experts. Like I said, all of the EQB member agencies were on the team, as well as we conducted focus groups around the state with citizens, as well as interviews with experts around the state that were not associated with state government, as well as we just had a public survey for seeking comment on what we should be focused on over the next 10 years. And so all these goals are framed to align with other strategic water planning efforts, like aligning with the Clean Water Council strategic plan or the performance report. So within each goal are strategies which detail the approach we recommend taking to achieve the goal, and you'll see those in the next couple slides. And then within each strategy are actions which are tools to pursue the objectives of the strategies. And the numbering here of goal 1 through 5 doesn't reflect priority. Okay, so goal number 1, ensure drinking water is safe and sufficient. Minnesota is projected to add approximately 500,000 more people to our population in the next 10 years, like adding another Minneapolis worth of people. Source water in many parts of Minnesota is already vulnerable to contamination. As I said, with the increased precipitation and runoff due to climate change, this can introduce agricultural nutrients, pesticides, and other contaminants of emerging concern into drinking water sources. And warmer and wetter conditions can increase the growth of harmful algal blooms, which can release toxins to source waters. And then flooding can also wash bacteria and other pathogens from the land into public and private wells. And so about 79% of Minnesotans get their water from community public water supplies, while the remaining 21% use private wells. There are about 1.2 million acres of land in drinking water supply management areas, and about 36% or 400,000 acres is considered vulnerable to contamination. And so this goal focuses on that we need to accelerate source water protection for community water systems, and that we need to emphasize source water protection in watershed management, and then prevent nitrate contamination of drinking water and groundwater. And so this includes work with the One Watershed, One Plan program and Twin Cities metro area, watershed plans to protect and restore surface and groundwater quality and other issues related to that. And so then to prevent that nitrate, we need to continue, the group worked on some actions related to that, and that's continuing to advance the implementation of the nitrogen fertilizer management plan, which is the blueprint for minimizing impacts of nitrogen fertilizer on groundwater. And then also continuing to implement the groundwater protection rule, which is designed for use in drinking water supply management areas, public water supplies. And so that's kind of just very high level of what goal 1 and the 3 strategies related to that are. And then now I'm going to pass it to Suzanne to talk about goal 2, 3, and 4.
Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'll start my video for just a minute. I know many of you, or at least your names are familiar. I see a few faces or names from DNR as well. But anyway, that's enough video. Okay, so as you've heard, we're seeing greater intensity and duration of rainfall, and which affects both the surface and groundwater quality by increasing nutrient and sediment runoff. And we see increases in volume and velocity of flows, which increase erosion and flooding. And so there's a lot of talk now there's a lot of interest in increasing soil health. Healthy soil is high in organic matter, so it holds more water, which can reduce runoff, and it can store large amounts of carbon, although there's a lot of ongoing research in this area. So there is some potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through methods such as cover crops and no-till cultivation. So some of the actions under this strategy include expanding the acreage of cover crops and what we call continuous living cover, like perennial crops. And this is aligned really with the state's goals under the nutrient reduction strategy, which PCA produces, and also the Clean Water Council's strategic plan, because both of those plans aim to expand cover crop use to about 2 million new acres by 2025 and up to 5 million acres by 2034. Right now, the 2017 Census of Agriculture cover crop use was just under 600,000 acres. So it's less than 2% of Minnesota farmland. And this is, I'll try to update with some of what's happening at the legislature this year. There's some recommendations from the Clean Water Council to include additional funding for cover crops and reduced tillage. And the governor's budget also included a new soil health program. And there's a lot of work that's being done through the Minnesota Office for Soil Health, which is a partnership between Bowser and University of Minnesota to do monitoring and develop metrics and do some actual assessment of soil health under different practices. So that's the first strategy. The second one is to look at opportunities to participate in what are called ecosystem service markets. And these encompass things like carbon offsets, carbon trading, carbon credits, and also water quality offsets. And as you probably know, PCA has been doing or managing water quality trading for several decades now through sort of on a permit by permit basis. But at the moment, there are expanding opportunities for ecosystem service markets. There's a pilot project happening now in the Sauk River watershed in Stearns County called the Ecosystem Market Consortium. And I know PCA is participating in that with an eye towards bringing in water quality trading. And you can kind of see by the graphic how this works. Typically, the buyer is a wastewater treatment plant. It might also be a water treatment plant. The improvements generate the improvements sort of upstream at the farm or field scale level generate the credits, and also a lot of additional benefits to habitat, water quality, and possibly carbon storage. So next slide, please. So this is an area that I know PCA is also quite heavily involved in, and there's additional activity happening here at the legislature, which, as you know, we have aging wastewater and stormwater and drinking water infrastructure across the state. These systems are vulnerable to increasing precip and extreme weather events and even long dry periods. And under the first strategy, we need better modeling to understand these threats. And this includes what's been termed next generation LIDAR. LIDAR, as you probably know, is a remote sensing technique that creates the detailed models of the landscape. And our LIDAR is now about 10 years old and needs to be updated. Another element is what's called the dynamically downscaled climate models, which will show kind of what is expected to be coming, the changes that are coming at the watershed or the county level. We have some new models for determining localized flood risk. These are discussed in the plan, such as the blue spot assessment. And so deploying all of these things will enable a better assessment of where the risks really are. Then the next set of strategies have to do with supporting communities with their resiliency planning for both wastewater, stormwater, and drinking water. And this is an area where there are some new initiatives at the legislature. The governor's budget actually proposed an updated resiliency financing mechanism, which is being termed resiliency bonds, which would, this is like an expansion of the grants under the Public Facilities Administration for stormwater improvements. And then the fourth strategy is looking at transportation infrastructure in floodplains, specifically culverts. Minnesota has 65,000 culverts. And this is an area where if they're too small or too large, you know, they can create additional flooding or scouring or loss of habitat. And both MnDOT and DNR have done a lot of work in designing culverts to allow more natural flows and sort of connected habitat across floodplains. Another thing that you'll see in this under this goal, if you look at the plan, is an emphasis on green infrastructure. You know, the green roofs, the bioswales, the permeable pavement. These things can be more expensive up front, but then more resilient in the long run. So next slide, we move along to goal 4, which really focuses on 2 primary strategies. One is storage and the other one is drainage. And this is another topic that is really been in the news lately, and that's probably one reason it assumed sort of a prominent position in this plan. This is where we mentioned earlier, the Minnesota River Valley flows have actually increased 75% in the past 2 decades. And I'm thinking, okay, I continue to learn more about this topic. I'm not sure if it's the peak flows or the annual flows, but I would say it's probably some of each. But by enhancing the ability of the land to hold water and slow runoff, we can reduce the erosion and the damage to infrastructure and the pollution through nitrates and phosphorus that we see coming downstream. So there's a lot of interest in creating more opportunities for water storage. And a lot of people think about the structural methods, the water and sediment retention basins, the grassed waterways, the impoundments. Some of them can be quite large, but also with the non-structural ones that like the conservation practices that improve soil health. And, you know, where do you locate the storage in relation to your particular watershed or sub-watershed? Should it be further upstream? Should it be further downstream? What are the downstream resources that you want to protect? It's a really complex topic. And right now, under the, I mentioned, we talked about the climate subcabinet. We have a work group now that's looking at storage, can we develop a storage inventory and a decision framework for deciding what type of storage you would use in what situations. Of course, we need funding mechanisms to compensate landowners for things like periodic flooding. Now, the other side of this is drainage. And this is quite interesting because drainage in Minnesota, you may know, is managed not by a state agency, but by individual drainage authorities for what's called the benefited landowners, the landowners who are benefited by that controlled drainage. There's not a lot of regional or standardized guidance, and managed drainage for sort of multi-purpose benefits has been promoted by the Drainage Work Group. That's an interagency and public group, but it really hasn't taken hold on a broad scale. So this strategy includes looking at more consistent standards and guidelines. We have some examples in this in the plan of, for example, the Red River Basin has really taken the lead in assessing how much storage is needed where and how that affects the timing and velocity and volume of runoff. And just a couple of examples that are gaining traction: the two-stage ditch, which creates kind of a floodplain for the ditch, and then controlled drainage, like using water-controlled structures to raise the depth of the drainage outlet so that water can be held in the field when the drainage isn't needed. But we need more incentives for this multi-purpose drainage management. And it is, in fact, being incorporated into local water planning. So both under the One Watershed, One Plan program and probably to some degree under RAPS, watershed entities are looking at storage and drainage and setting goals for those as part of their planning processes. So a lot of material there. Let me pass this back over to Erik now to wrap up with the last goal and then something about implementation.
All right, thanks, Suzanne. And so goal 5 is about promote resiliency and quality of life. As we've talked about, water provides benefits to our basic needs, but beyond our basic needs, it enhances our quality of life. Water is part of Minnesota's identity. It's integral to the recreation, our livelihoods, spirituality, and sense of well-being in many Minnesotans. And so in order to support recreational activities, recreational infrastructure needs to withstand Minnesota's changing climate. Design of new recreational infrastructure must take into account new realities of climate change, and funding will be required to deal with repairs, closures, and cleanup following extreme weather events at existing facilities. Climate change also threatens the quality of Minnesota's beaches and recreational waters. Warm temperatures are more conducive to the growth of algae and bacteria, and with more frequent intense rain events, increased stormwater runoff can wash bacteria from the land into the recreational waters, and some beaches are experiencing high numbers of closures in these wet years due to increased bacteria levels in the water. And Minnesota state law doesn't require beach monitoring. However, some local public health departments or cities regularly monitor beach water quality, providing periodic snapshots of water conditions. And we worked with folks at Department of Health in looking at, can we do a statewide public communication regarding water quality and safety of beaches, and that's something they were working on. Climate change also is impacting fish and aquatic habitat, and we need to work on managing fish and aquatic habitat for resilience. Fishing connects Minnesotans to the water for both sustenance and recreation. It reinforces our seasonal cultural traditions, and climate change is altering fisheries in Minnesota due to warming waters, heavy rain events, shorter and milder winters. And this could mean more fish harvest opportunities for some species, but fewer opportunities for other. And then strategy 4 is about we need to conduct more research and engagement to address the impacts of changing water resources and ecosystems on mental health and well-being. Emerging research seeks to better understand the psychological and emotional impacts of climate change. As climate change impacts water resources, Minnesotans may experience a sense of loss, anxiety, or despair linked to these impacts. And so this was something that is different than really any state water plan we've had before in talking about doing some social science work around how climate change may impact Minnesotans. And so that's the 5 goals at pretty high levels. What we're doing for next steps is we're continuing doing presentations and discussions around the state. Just yesterday did presentations with 50 high schoolers from all around the state. And that's one nice thing, I guess, about working remote or schooling remote, is it's a lot easier to get students together and have a discussion about how climate change is impacting their communities, water resources, and teaching them about where their drinking water comes from, or how flooding may impact their drinking water. And that's just one of many that we're still continuing to do. We're also in the process of working with EQB member agencies and other partners on implementation pathways. So right now we're kind of going through the state water plan, and for each goal, strategy, and action, trying to kind of assign metrics to it, so that then we can come back on a yearly basis to the EQB board and tell them how we're doing, because in 5 years we have a water policy report due. So we do that every 5 years, and a water plan every 10 years per direction from the legislature. And then just continuing in the work on, assessing how we're doing and how implementation is doing, to align with other efforts where we can. EQB, we are just more of a convener. We don't do the actual work on this stuff. That's what you all do, and we're really appreciative of that. And so we try and do as much as we can to help convene and communicate what's going on between the different agencies and different efforts. And then so just in these presentations and discussions, continue to shine a spotlight on climate change. And then, like I said, we're going to report back to the board, as well as Met Council's asked us to come back, and Clean Water Council and the Drainage Work Group has asked us to come back. And so we'll probably be spending time each year reporting back to these different groups and see how we're doing or what they need as we move forward. And so with that, thanks a lot. There's my email and Suzanne's email, and if you have any questions, we're here.
Yeah, I'm always interested in, hopefully we do have some time for questions. I'm interested in knowing how some of the themes and topics in the water plan kind of intersect with the work that you're doing, or your priorities for your particular programs. So if anyone wants to respond to that, or are there topics that you feel you want to know more about that we could cover in more detail, or interest in what's going on with the legislative session, because many of these topics are kind of rising to the surface this year.
All right, well, thank you, Eric and Suzanne. If anybody has any questions that you would like to ask, it would be great to go ahead and put those in the chat. Or you can certainly just unmute yourself as well and ask any questions that you might have.
I have a question.
I'm going to stop sharing here, Brooke. Go ahead.
I have a question. Suzanne, you mentioned the Ecosystem Services Project. I think you said was it the Sauk River?
Yeah, it is.
Can you provide me just a few more details on that? I hadn't heard about that.
Okay, well, it's a pilot project. The Ecosystem Services Market Consortium is a national initiative that has about 5 or 6 projects across the country. This is the first one in the sort of northern, the upper Midwest, northern Great Plains. And they picked that particular watershed because of the presence of pasture and grazing, and the fact that it lies upstream, like the Crow River, from these major metropolitan areas where water quality, where source water protection is particularly important. Now it's a 2-year pilot, and it just it kicked off this summer. It involves some funding from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, and Assistant PCA Director Katrina Kessler is involved, I think, in terms of trying to create the sort of linking the project with water quality trading efforts, but I'm not sure how far along that has gotten. I think right now they're still, they're working with the partners include the Nature Conservancy, the Ag Department's Ag Water Quality Certification Program, General Mills. There's a whole host of crop consultants and sort of private sector entities that are involved. And it's at this point they're recruiting growers. They're going to be measuring soil health and soil organic matter and metrics like that. And then they'll be putting conservation practices into effect over the next couple of years and trying to generate credits. And my understanding is that there could potentially be a carbon credit and a water quality credit. But then the next piece, of course, is finding buyers for the credits. And I think that what I last heard was those buyers would likely be, say, wastewater treatment facilities in the smaller cities downstream. Minneapolis and the Met Council have sufficiently robust wastewater and water treatment that they probably don't need the credits. So there's a lot of moving parts, and if you want, I can share a few. I can share some other resources, which if I can, I'll put them in the chat, or I can share them with you directly.
Great, thanks. Maybe we could talk at a later time about this. I'd like to talk about
Yeah, and I can't see your last name there, but
Henningsgaard.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we've connected in the past on water quality trading. So yes, I can follow up.
Okay. Thank you.
I just put a link in the chat there to some of the pilot project.
Great. And then I see there's a question about informing and uniting the drainage organizations for other environmental benefits other than drainage. I guess, this is an area where I'm often speaking from a position of relative ignorance, because drainage is a very complicated issue. Drainage in Minnesota is governed by a large chapter of statute. Chapter 103E is the drainage law, and it kind of takes years to become an expert there. But I think I would direct you, and I'll find this link in a minute, but the efforts of the Drainage Work Group, which has participation from PCA and other agencies, as well as law firms and engineering firms and some drainage authorities, that is, seriously considering, they make changes, they recommend changes to the statutes, and they discuss issues like this. I think that the challenge is that the drainage authorities, as I indicated, are local entities that are responsible to their members, to their benefited landowners. And so they may not be that inclined or cognizant of the downstream impacts of increased drainage. If you keep doing more and more tile drainage, you're likely to increase the flows and the sort of flashiness of the flows downstream. And drainage authorities are required to look for other funding sources when they are contemplating a repair or an improvement, but they don't have to. They're not required by statute to consider those multi-purpose benefits. Really complicated topics. Let me know if that helps at all, or if we need to look for some other resources to point you towards.
This is Scott Kaiser here. I have a question about drought. I and my colleague Emily Brault and Steve Weiss, we've been doing some research into drought and the history of drought in Minnesota, and I've kind of become a drought alarmist after reading the drought history of Minnesota. Like the DNR ranks the 1930 Dust Bowl drought as the worst environmental disaster in Minnesota. The 2013 flash drought in the Midwest was just recently ranked by a group of economists as the most the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history because of crop failure. And so it seems like a lot of when Minnesota talks about planning for climate change in the future, there's a lot of focus on rain events, and that's probably because the last 25 years have been wet. But it seems like in terms of the possibility for misery, nothing is worse than a drought. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you think about droughts in the future? Are you starting to think more about drought planning? And just maybe talk a little bit more about how you think about droughts.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So we worked with the DNR State Climatology Office, and they are actually currently working on the Minnesota State Drought Plan. And so we really relied on them for any information that they were putting together. I don't think that they've completed the State Drought Plan yet. I was just looking on the web here, but it's something that both Kenny and Luigi there said that, you know, they are very concerned about, and there's definitely work being done related to the drought plan for the state of Minnesota, but they were just still kind of gathering information right now. And but I think you're right. It is a big concern, because a lot of what the U of M folks were showing us is that although we may be getting more precipitation overall, they're coming in big events, and then there will be dry spells. And that's what most of their models are pointing to, is that there will be these extreme events, which we saw on those maps, or we've seen that are in the EQB plan. We'll have these big events, and then that'll be bigger than they currently are, and then we'll have long spells, especially during the growing season, of dry spells, and how you know, that's going to drive some more runoff problems, runoff and sediment, and that, you know, that's something they're currently seeing in the models. But as Kenny and Luigi said, like, don't count drought out. So it's coming, and they're developing the drought response plan, an update to it, and then also Minnesota State Hazard Mitigation Plan. So the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management also just updated that in 2019, and they're also considering that and what we should be ready for. But some of the goals and strategies that we talked about, like in goal 4 there about more water storage on the land, hopefully can ameliorate some of that as well. And so hopefully some of these strategies and actions can help us prepare for that. But we just didn't focus on it as much because the DNR is really, that's their bailiwick with the drought plan.
So and I see there's a question, is there any emphasis on environmental justice or racial disparity in the water plan? And yes, there's a section in, I think we certainly recognized it, especially the fact that the plan was being developed in the midst of a pandemic that exacerbated inequities and, you know, civil unrest and racially based, you know, oppression became all the more obvious. And so, but yes, the engagement section in the first part of the plan talks about the need for kind of meeting people where they are, listening to their experiences, which will differ based upon race and gender and ethnicity and so on. And especially there is a large section in the plan on tribal nations and water and climate change. And I know Katie Pratt, who's the EQB director, spent a lot of time reaching out and sort of incorporating some of the lessons from some of the tribal climate response plans that are out there. You know, I think this is a case where we could always do more, and it might be more of an emphasis going forward as the plan gets implemented. So, Erik, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think you're right, Suzanne. Yeah, I mean, we did the best, and we could this time, and I think we can do better. I think, you know, for the next water plan, we're going to try and engage tribes and underrepresented groups in the next water plan sooner. You know, I think with this water plan, we had big plans for it, and then COVID hit and we had to do everything remotely. And I think, you know, that's just kind of how it changed things in how we could hold interviews or focus groups. It just was a lot harder there in that beginning transition. But this is the first state water plan to have a whole section dedicated to tribal issues and how tribes are planning for climate change and water resource management, and then also discussing environmental justice and how that's something we need to incorporate in all work we do. We have this section in the beginning of the water plan called Water Plan Principles, and it kind of lays out what in all this work that we're suggesting we do in each of these actions, that we have these principles underlying this plan. And
so I have a question for you guys. A while back, we had Trevor Russell come from the Friends of the Mississippi River come talk to us about water quality issues, obviously in relation to the Mississippi River. And one of the conclusions that he left us with was that he really didn't think that we were going to be able, I'm paraphrasing here, but he didn't really think that we're going to be able to reach our goals on water quality and some of the environmental quality standards that we wanted to reach under the current system of agriculture that we had in this state. And, you know, as we all know, it's one thing to have goals and identify problems. It's another thing to be able to achieve them. So I'm kind of wondering how you might respond to that in relation to the state water plan. You know, are we going to be able to achieve our ambitious goals that we want to go see going forward when we have this current system of agriculture in the state, you know, that is centered on corn and soybean commodity crops? Is that going to be something that we can really achieve, or do we need to see, you know, wholesale changes there in the way we do agriculture in the state?
Yeah, tough question.
that's a tough question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's certainly, the current system certainly makes it more difficult. But part of that difficulty comes from the way those sort of commodity systems are managed. You know, I think if you could reform or sort of turn the ocean liner to the point where you saw a substantial substantial percentage of the acreage of cropland successfully placed in cover crops and also perennial crops. I know Trevor, I've worked with Trevor and FMR in the past on trying to advance some of the forever green crops that the university has been developing, such as Kernza, you know, the perennial wheatgrass, which we also highlight in the plan. I think you will start to see progress, but some of that progress may be kind of localized. For example, in those drinking water supply management areas, it's pretty clear that in some parts of the state, you really can reverse a groundwater quality problem through planting perennials in an extended crop rotation. So it could be kerns, it could be alfalfa, could be, you know, small grains like oats followed by a cover crop. But again, that's kind of localized. And in terms of surface water quality, I think it is harder to move the needle. You can see larger impacts on groundwater, I think, at least under certain geologic conditions than you can to surface water.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would agree with what Suzanne was saying. And I think, you know, it's can't really be an all or nothing. I don't know if we can turn the ship on our current ag land cover. But I think what the plan tried to do was look at what are some things we can do to mitigate some of those impacts. And, you know, like Dave Wall helped us from the PCA and consulted with us on this and working on the nutrient reduction strategy and their goal of 1.9 million new acres of living cover on those ag fields. And I think, you know, what his data showed is that can actually make a pretty big impact on what we're seeing for nutrients running off and the impacts of the soy, corn, ag marketplace. So the plan tried to talk about, you know, what can we do to mitigate some of that stuff. And there's all these programs that support soil health that we listed, I think, on page 31 of the plan. And so I don't know if it's really an option to say that, you know, we're going to change the ag land cover practices. I think it's about what we do with those practices and how we're smarter about them. But that's a tough question, Mark. I think if any of us could totally figure that out, we could retire tomorrow.
Well, I knew I'd be putting you on the spot there a little bit, but I really wanted to see how you'd respond to that. It's a good answer. I mean, it's not all you can say about it, I think.
I think the good thing is that we're really paying attention to that now, and there's so many programs that are working on trying to get at that problem.
So I have a question before we go. Are these water forums generally advertised, for example, in PCA Today? Because I see a few other non-PCA people who have joined in. Are they open to any state agency staff?
Yeah, that's a good question. We try to advertise these talks in a couple of ways. We put, we put in a summary and an announcement into the PCA Today, as you noted, and then we have a mailing list that we send announcements out to people who are interested in the Water Issues Forum as well. So a couple of different ways. People from different agencies are certainly welcome to tune in and check it out. And we try to solicit talks from people in the different agencies too, so that we can all stay abreast of what it is that people are doing out there. And it's hard enough to know, but we try to feature what people are doing out there in the different agencies as well.
Okay, good to know. Thanks.
Well, if people have not taken a look at that 2020 State Water Plan, I really would encourage people to do it. It's a really nicely done plan, very readable, I thought. You can skim it and get the gist of what it is that they put together. And I really enjoyed reading it. And thanks for telling us about it.
Thanks for having us, Mark. Thank you all for the good questions.
All right.